At first glance, victory in war is the result of the valor of commanders, the courage of soldiers, the sharpness of swords, and the reliability of shields. We see triumphant processions and parades, but behind this heroic picture lies something much more fundamental and prosaic: food. The Roman Empire, its legions, its cities, all of this functioned and prospered thanks to one factor: the uninterrupted supply of food. This system was more complex than any engineering project, and more important than the most impregnable fortress. It was the true heart of the empire. Roman commanders understood this better than anyone. They knew that an army marches on its stomach. One hungry legion and the battle is lost. One hungry city and a riot breaks out. Rome's food logistics is not just a story about food, it is a story about power, about control over vast territories, and about the ability to maintain order in a chaotic world. This system was so perfect that it still inspires admiration today, but it also had its failures. Watch the video to the end to find out how just 1 week without grain could destroy an entire legion. Ancient Rome was a world without refrigerators, canned food, or fast delivery. Everything that was consumed had to be grown, harvested, processed, and transported. And this was not a small village, but a huge empire. Roman logistics began with simple things. Land. The Romans paid great attention to agriculture, especially the cultivation of grain. The main food product was bread, and therefore wheat. Wheat was grown on giant plantations in Egypt, North Africa, and Sicily, which were called the breadbaskets of Rome. After harvesting, the grain was transported to huge barns and from there to ships. Shipping across the Mediterranean Sea was the basis of the entire system. Huge transport ships loaded with grain sailed between the provinces and the port city of Ostia, which was the gateway to Rome. To ensure the smooth operation of this maritime conveyor belt, the Romans built lighthouses, harbors, and warehouses. Harvesting and subsequent delivery were part of a complex tax system. The breadbasket provinces had to pay a tax in the form of grain. This tax, known as decime, tithe, was mandatory for all farmers. The state hired special officials, publicans, to collect this tax. Publicans were responsible not only for collecting grain, but also for its quality. They made sure that no straw or sand was mixed in with the grain, that it was dry and suitable for long-term storage. After collection, the grain was transported to provincial granaries, called goria. These storage facilities were built using a special technology that protected the grain from moisture and pests. The floors were raised, and the walls were made of thick stone masonry. This was extremely important, as a spoiled harvest meant famine and riots. From there, the grain was transported to ports, where it was loaded onto ships. The Roman fleet was not only military, but also commercial. Hundreds of ships, called naves lucularii, sailed the Mediterranean Sea daily. Managing this fleet was a difficult task. Routes were carefully planned to avoid storms and pirate ambushes. Navigation in ancient times was a dangerous business, and many ships were lost. The loss of even one ship carrying grain could cause supply problems in Rome. Therefore, sea routes were carefully guarded. The ships themselves were designed specifically for transporting grain. They were wide and spacious. The wooden hulls were covered with lead plates to protect them from worms and algae. The cargo was carefully stowed so that it would not shift during a storm. The grain was transported in huge sacks for easy loading and unloading. When the ships arrived in Ostia, the second part of the logistics operation began. The grain was unloaded and transferred to granaries located right in the port. From there, it was loaded onto small barges and transported along the Tiber River to Rome itself. Unloading and loading were labor-intensive processes that required a large number of workers. Slaves and free citizens were used for this work. In Rome, grain was stored in huge state granaries called horia. These warehouses were true masterpieces of engineering. They were enormous, could hold hundreds of thousands of tons of grain, and had a complex ventilation system. Grain was stored in them for years, which allowed Rome to survive in the event of crop failure or temporary cessation of supplies. And yet, which part of this gigantic system was most vulnerable to sabotage? Share your thoughts in the comments. When grain arrived in Ostia, it had to be delivered to Rome itself, as well as to the legions stationed throughout the empire. This is where the legendary Roman roads came into play. We tend to think of them as routes for the rapid movement of troops, but their main function was logistical. The roads allowed large volumes of cargo to be transported by cart. It was slower than by sea, but much more reliable. Warehouses and rest stops were built along the roads. They were called stations where travelers and legionnaires could replenish their food and water supplies and repair their carts. All of this was part of a carefully planned network. Without this road system, the army simply could not have existed. It was this road network that made it possible for the legion to travel tens of kilometers with supplies. The Roman road network was an engineering marvel. Roads were built to strict standards using layers of gravel, sand, and stone. This made them incredibly strong and durable, capable of withstanding the weight of heavy loads. The Romans built roads straight, avoiding turns and inclines whenever possible to shorten the route and facilitate movement. The roads connected cities, fortresses, and provinces, forming a single network that covered the entire empire. In addition to stations, larger settlements, called mansio, were built along the roads which served as centers for trade and supply. There you could find inns, smithies, workshops, and other services. These settlements were similar to modern roadside motels and cafes, only in Roman style. They played an important role in ensuring the safety and comfort of travelers and legionnaires. Road construction was not only a matter of logistics, but also a political tool. Roads helped integrate conquered territories into the Roman Empire. They facilitated the movement of officials, the collection of taxes, and the spread of Roman culture. The road was a symbol of Roman power and order, a reminder that even the most remote provinces were under Rome's control. Mile markers were also placed along the roads, stone pillars indicating the distance to the nearest cities. This helped travelers navigate and plan their routes. Mile markers were similar to modern road signs and were part of a carefully designed navigation system. Roads were also used for communication. Couriers traveled along them, delivering important messages and orders from Rome to the most remote corners of the empire. This communication system was vital for governing a huge state. It allowed emperors and commanders to quickly receive information and make decisions. Without this system, communication between the center and the provinces would have been impossible. Roman roads were so important that their condition was carefully monitored. There were special officials, road curators, who were responsible for their repair and maintenance. They made sure that the roads were always in good condition and that there were no obstacles on them. This maintenance system was part of a state policy aimed at maintaining order and stability. Thus, Roman roads were not just paths, they were the lifeblood of the empire, nourishing it and allowing it to grow. They were a symbol of Roman power, strength, and order. They were what made Rome great. But what other less obvious purpose did Roman roads serve, apart from trade and troop movements? Watch the video to the end to find out the answer to this question. A Roman legionnaire was not only a soldier, but also a walking warehouse. In addition to weapons and armor, he carried his own rations. The ration was strictly regulated, approximately 850 grams of grain per day. The grain was not ground so that it could be stored longer and would not spoil. The legionnaires ground it in hand mills and baked bread right in the field. In addition to grain, the ration also included lard, cheese, and legumes. Soldiers were given salt and sometimes wine. All these products were nutritious and did not spoil during the campaign. But even with such a diet, the soldiers had to rely on the local population. During their campaigns, the legionnaires practiced foraging, that is, gathering provisions in the surrounding area. The foragers collected everything they could find: fruits, vegetables, nuts, and sometimes even domestic animals. This was part of the military strategy, not to depend entirely on centralized supplies. The legionnaires' diet was well thought out and balanced. Grain, as the main component, provided soldiers with energy. It was used to make pulmentum, a thick porridge, or panis militaris, army bread, which was baked on hot stones. Lard was a source of fat and calories, and cheese was a source of protein. Legumes supplemented the diet with fiber and important nutrients. Wine diluted with water not only quenched thirst, but also disinfected the water. This was extremely important, as water was often dirty during campaigns. The legion's food supply system was two-tiered. The first tier was an individual ration that each soldier carried with them. it was usually enough for 3 days. The second level was a common supply that was transported on carts. This supply was calculated for several weeks and was used in case foraging was impossible. This supply included not only food, but also fodder for animals, oats and barley. Foraging was not just a matter of gathering food, but a real tactical operation. The foraging detachment was always accompanied by guards, as they were vulnerable to attack. Enemies often attacked foragers to weaken the army and deprive it of food. In such conditions, foragers had to act quickly and secretly. If they managed to gather enough provisions, it was a great victory. However, foraging was not always successful. Enemy armies could use scorched earth tactics, destroying crops and taking away livestock to deprive the Romans of food. In such cases, the legionaries had to rely only on their own supplies. This was especially dangerous during winter campaigns, when it was almost impossible to find provisions in the wild. In such situations, the legionaries faced a real threat of starvation. Hunger was one of the legion's most formidable enemies. Food shortages led to the weakening of soldiers, loss of combat effectiveness, and, ultimately, mutinies. History knows many examples when hunger led to defeat. Roman commanders tried to avoid such situations and always kept the issue of supplies under control. They understood that an army that cannot feed itself cannot win. All this shows how important logistics were for the Roman army. Food was not just fuel for the body, but a strategic resource that determined the outcome of battles. The ability to feed a huge army in campaign conditions was what made the Romans invincible. Winter campaigns were a nightmare for logisticians. Roads were covered with snow, rivers froze, and ships could not go to sea because of storms. Legions often remained without replenishment of supplies. In such conditions, they had to survive on what they had with them. Supplies lasted for a couple of weeks, and then problems began. In some cases, soldiers had to go without food for several days. Historians have described how legionnaires, in desperation, ate leaves, roots, and anything else they could find. Such campaigns were called hunger marches. Morale fell and discipline weakened. In such conditions, legionnaires often rebelled. Hunger was a far more formidable enemy than any enemy army. Winter marches were a real test of survival. Snow and ice made the roads impassable for carts, and the cold penetrated to the bone. Legionnaires, accustomed to the warm climate of the Mediterranean, suffered from frostbite and hypothermia. Rome's enemies often exploited this weakness by attacking the legions during the winter. In such conditions, when every step was a struggle, hunger became the last straw. In conditions of hunger, discipline collapsed. Soldiers who had recently been united began to act on their own. They could loot a village, even if there was no order to do so, just to find a little food. Such actions could lead to conflicts with the local population, which in turn could provoke an uprising. Thus, hunger was not only a physical threat, but also a political one. Roman commanders tried to avoid winter campaigns, but sometimes it was unavoidable. In such cases, they took all possible measures to provide their soldiers with food. They created reserves in advance in fortified camps and set out on a campaign with only enough provisions to feed them until the next supply point. But even these measures did not always help. Historical chronicles are full of examples of entire legions dying of starvation. For example, during the Gallic Wars, the legion led by Caesar was surrounded and forced to eat whatever it could find. The soldiers ate tree bark, roots, and even meat that was considered inedible. In such conditions, Caesar proved himself not only as a great commander, but also as a leader who could inspire his people and keep their spirits up. Hunger was also a serious psychological weapon. Rome's enemies often used scorched earth tactics to deprive the Romans of provisions. They destroyed crops, poisoned wells, and stole livestock. This was very effective, as even the strongest army cannot fight on an empty stomach. The Romans responded in kind, but in conditions where they were in foreign lands, this was much more difficult. Therefore, logistics was a top priority for Roman commanders. They knew that even the most brilliant tactics and the most valiant army would not be able to win if their soldiers were hungry. And if hunger could force legionnaires to eat roots, what would they be willing to do when they found out that someone in Rome had decided to profit from this? Let's find out right now. Logistics concerned not only the army, but the entire empire. In Rome, there was a special position, the prefect of the Annona, who was responsible for supplying the city. It was one of the most important and responsible positions. His task was to ensure that Rome always had enough grain so that bread prices remained affordable. The grain that was brought to Rome was stored in huge granaries. From there, it was distributed among bakeries, and some of it was given to citizens in need. This system was vital for maintaining order. Popular uprisings most often began because of hunger or high bread prices. Therefore, emperors considered it their duty to provide bread and circuses. Price controls were strict. If merchants began to speculate, they faced severe punishment. The state purchased grain at fixed prices and sold it at subsidized prices to prevent famine. The position of prefect of the Annona was so important that only the most trusted and reliable individuals could hold it. This official not only controlled grain supplies but also managed a huge fleet that transported grain from the provinces and supervised the work of ports and warehouses. He was a kind of food minister who was fully responsible for the welfare of the whole of Rome. His decisions could save the city from famine or led to mass unrest. The grain distribution system, known as the Annona, was complex and well organized. It included the free distribution of grain or its sale at very low prices. It was an effective way to calm the masses and prevent riots. However, this system also had its drawbacks. It created dependence of citizens on the state and could lead to corruption. In Rome, there were special warehouses, called horea, which could hold huge amounts of grain. They were so large that they could supply the city with grain for several months. These warehouses were true masterpieces of engineering, with thick walls, reliable locks, and a complex ventilation system to prevent the grain from spoiling. Dozens, even hundreds of people worked there to keep order. In addition to grain, the state also controlled other products. Olive oil and wine were also important commodities that were supplied to Rome in huge quantities. Control over their supply and prices was no less important than that over grain. The Romans used wine and oil in their daily lives, and a shortage of these could also lead to discontent. The price control system was part of Rome's broader economic policy. The state sought stability and order. It understood that economic stability was the foundation of political stability. Therefore, it intervened in the market when necessary to prevent chaos. This was not always popular with merchants, but it was vital for the people. Roman emperors often used the distribution of grain and other goods to win the love of the people. This policy, known as bread and circuses, was very effective. It helped emperors maintain power and popularity, even if their reign was not always successful. The people who received free bread were willing to forgive their ruler for many things. Ultimately, Rome's food logistics system was one of the most remarkable in history. It fed a city of millions and a huge army, and was the foundation of the entire empire. Without this system, Rome would not have been able to achieve its greatness. Maritime trade was the foundation of the entire food system. Huge ships called lucularia could carry hundreds of tons of grain. Ancient sailors were true heroes. They sailed through storms and pirate ambushes to provide Rome with food. Pirates were another serious threat. They could intercept a ship carrying grain, and then the entire region could be on the brink of starvation. To combat pirates, Rome created special fleets that patrolled the sea lanes. Sometimes the Romans had to wage real wars to protect their trade routes. For example, the famous war against the Cilician pirates, led by Pompey the Great, was primarily a war for Rome's food security. All this suggests that food was not just a product, but a strategic resource for which wars were fought. And what was the most dangerous thing for Roman sea traders? Stay with us. The answer will surprise you. Maritime caravans were a vital artery connecting Rome with its bread baskets, Egypt, North Africa, and Sicily. These merchant ships, equipped with large square sails, were designed to carry huge volumes of cargo. Speed was not their priority, but capacity was a key factor. On average, such a ship could carry up to 500 tons of grain, which is equivalent to provisions for an entire legion for a year. Traveling across the Mediterranean Sea was unpredictable. The sailors' main enemies were not only pirates, but also nature. Sudden storms could smash a ship against the rocks or sink it. Sailors had to rely on their knowledge of the stars and currents, as well as their experience. During the winter months, sailing almost completely stopped due to storms, and Rome lived on the supplies accumulated during the summer. Piracy was a constant threat to trade routes. Pirates lay in wait in narrow straits and off the coast, attacking lone ships. They looted cargoes and took crews captive, sometimes even sinking ships to cover their tracks. The Roman Empire waged a real war against pirates. In 67 BC, Pompey the Great was given extraordinary powers to put an end to piracy in the Mediterranean once and for all. His campaign was brilliant and swift, and within a few months he had cleared the sea of pirates, allowing the uninterrupted supply of food to be restored. Internal problems were no less dangerous. The lack of navigation charts and instruments meant that ships often got lost at sea. Errors in calculations could cause a ship to stray far off course. Sailors had to rely on experience and luck. In addition, ships were very vulnerable to fire, and even a small spark could lead to disaster. The maritime trade system was so important that it was closely monitored by the state. Special fleets were created to protect it, patrolling the sea routes. These fleets were part of the Roman Navy, which was designed to protect Rome's trading interests. Grain transport ships were also part of the state system, and their captains were personally responsible for the safety of the cargo. Ultimately, maritime trade was the foundation of Rome's entire food system. It made it possible to sustain life in a huge city and supply legions stationed in the most remote corners of the empire. This system was complex and dangerous, but it worked. It was the foundation on which the entire empire was built. And what was the most dangerous thing for Roman sea traders? Stay with us. The answer will surprise you. In addition to food, water was an equally important resource. The Romans built a complex system of aqueducts that delivered water to cities. Water was needed not only for drinking, but also for agriculture, public baths, and fountains. Aqueducts were true masterpieces of engineering. They were durable and reliable, and some of them have survived to this day. This system was so important that even in wartime, Rome's enemies tried to destroy it. The destruction of an aqueduct could deprive an entire city of water, making it an easy target. But the Romans knew this and carefully guarded their waterways. Roman aqueducts were not just channels for water, but symbols of power and civilization. The construction of aqueducts was a complex and costly project. It required not only enormous resources, but also knowledge in the fields of engineering and hydraulics. Roman engineers calculated the slope so that water would flow by gravity, built tunnels through mountains and bridges across valleys. All this was done with one goal in mind: to provide cities and legions with clean water. Water was needed not only for drinking, it was necessary for maintaining hygiene, for operating public baths and fountains, and for irrigating fields. In cities with large populations, clean water was vital for preventing epidemics. The Romans were the first to understand that hygiene was the key to health, and they did everything possible to provide their citizens with clean water. Aqueducts were built from durable materials, stone and concrete, which made them incredibly long-lasting. Some of them are still in use today. They were so sturdy that they could withstand earthquakes and other natural disasters. The aqueduct system also had military significance. During campaigns, legions carried water skins with them, but this was not enough for long campaigns. Therefore, the Romans built small aqueducts and canals to supply their camps and fortresses with water. This was vital as the army could not fight without water. Guarding aqueducts was part of military strategy. Rome's enemies knew that destroying an aqueduct could lead to the surrender of a city, so they often attacked them. The Romans, in turn, carefully guarded their waterways by setting up posts and garrisons. In some cases, they even built fortresses around aqueducts to protect them from attack. Roman aqueducts were not only functional, but also beautiful. They were part of the urban landscape and testified to the greatness of the Roman Empire. They were a symbol of the progress and civilization that Rome brought to the conquered lands. The construction of aqueducts was one of the most ambitious projects in history. They were proof that the Romans could solve the most complex engineering problems. They were a symbol of their strength, power, and will to win. Every city and every legionary camp had warehouses, horea, where provisions were stored. These warehouses were designed to protect food from moisture and pests. The walls were thick and the floors were raised to ensure ventilation. Grain was stored in sacks or poured into large containers. In addition to grain, other products were stored in warehouses: wine, olive oil, salt, and beans. The entire system was carefully planned and controlled by officials. This made it possible to maintain a constant supply of food, even if deliveries from the provinces were temporarily interrupted. The food storage system in the Roman Empire was incredibly advanced and efficient. Granaries were not just buildings, but veritable fortresses for food. They were designed with all the risks associated with long-term food storage in mind. Thick stone and concrete walls protected against temperature and humidity fluctuations. Raised floors, supported by columns, ensured air circulation, which prevented the appearance of mold and pests. Wooden floors were treated with special compounds to repel insects. The size and location of these warehouses were strategically planned. In Rome, for example, the Horae were located in the port area of Ostia and along the Tiber River to facilitate unloading from ships and delivery to the city. In the provinces and legion camps, the Horae were built in the center, next to the administrative buildings. This allowed for control of the supplies and ensured their safety. Every part of this system was under control. In addition to grain, other goods were also stored in the granaries. Wine and olive oil, which were important products for the Romans, were stored in large clay amphorae. The amphorae were tightly sealed and placed in special compartments to prevent them from breaking. Salt, which was a valuable commodity, was stored in sacks. All products were carefully cataloged and labeled. Special officials called Goreari controlled the warehouses and kept strict records of all stocks. They recorded how much food came in, how much was issued, and how much remained. This accounting system was very accurate, which helped to avoid food shortages. Documents found by archaeologists show that this system was incredibly sophisticated and complex. In the legion camps, the Gueria were even more important. They provided provisions for soldiers in case of siege or interruption of supplies. They stored supplies for several months. This allowed the legions to be autonomous and not dependent on central supplies. In case of extreme necessity, soldiers could eat these supplies, which enabled them to withstand a long siege. The system of warehouses and granaries was part of Rome's broader military and economic strategy. It allowed the empire to maintain order and stability by providing food for the cities and the army. Without this system, Rome would not have been able to rule such a vast state. It was proof that the Romans understood the importance of logistics and that they could solve the most complex problems. In addition to physical protection, the warehouses also had a complex management system. For example, in Roman cities, Horia not only stored food, but were also used as wholesale trade centers. Private traders and farmers could rent space in them to store their goods. This created an organized market and facilitated trade. Entry to such warehouses was strictly regulated and guarded by guards. In every legionary camp where troops were based, Horiae were a key element of defense. They were usually located in the most protected part of the camp, next to the commander's quarters, so that in case of an attack, enemies could not reach the supplies. The walls of the warehouses could be as thick as the walls of a fortress and had small windows to prevent enemies from getting inside. The inventory system was as complex as the architecture of the warehouses themselves. Each delivery of grain or other products was carefully weighed and recorded on special tablets. When provisions were issued, a record was also kept, which allowed the quartermasters to always know how much food was left and how many days it would last. This system prevented theft and irrational use of resources. This warehouse system was part of Roman pragmatism. The Romans did not rely on luck, but always prepared for the worst. They knew that in times of war and instability, food supplies were the key to survival. That is why they invested enormous resources in building and maintaining this system. It was a symbol of their strength and their ability to plan for the long term. Without this system, Rome would not have been able to survive. On campaigns, legionaries not only carried food, but also cooked it. They knew how to bake bread and cook porridge. During rest stops, legionaries built fires, set up tripods, and hung pots. It was a kind of ritual that helped maintain morale. A hot meal after a hard day was not just food, but a symbol of care and order. Commanders made sure that every legionnaire had the opportunity to cook for himself. It was part of their duty to take care of their people. Without food, the army would not be able to fight. The field kitchen was an important part of the legion's daily life. It was a place where soldiers could rest, socialize, and recharge their batteries. Cooking was a collective effort, and everyone participated. Responsibilities were divided among the legionnaires. Some gathered firewood, some carried water, and some cooked. This system worked like clockwork and allowed thousands of people to be fed in a short time. The main dish was pulmentum, a thick porridge made from grain. It was cooked in large cauldrons and served with lard, cheese, or beans. It was a simple but nutritious dish that provided soldiers with the energy they needed. Other dishes were also prepared in the field, but porridge was the staple of the diet. Legionnaires also baked panis militaris, army bread. To do this, they used hand mills to grind grain, then kneaded the dough and baked flatbread on hot stones or in small portable ovens. The bread was hard but could be stored for a long time. It was convenient to take with them on campaigns. In addition to their main meals, legionnaires supplemented their diet with whatever they could find in the surrounding area. Foragers brought back fruit, vegetables, and game. All of this helped to diversify their diet and replenish their vitamin reserves. This was vital as a lack of vitamins could lead to diseases such as scurvy. Hygiene in the field kitchen was primitive, but they tried to maintain it. Cauldrons were washed and tools were cleaned. Water for cooking was taken from clean sources. This was important, as dirty water could cause epidemics. The field kitchen was not only a place for cooking, but also a place for socializing. Legionnaires gathered around the fires, told stories, and joked. This helped them relax and forget about the hardships of the march. The commanders, knowing this, did not interfere. On the contrary, they encouraged such communication, as it strengthened morale. Ultimately, the field kitchen was a symbol of order and stability. It was the heart of the camp, where every legionnaire could get his share of food and rest after a hard day. This was what made the Roman army so strong. It was well organized, disciplined, and always ready for battle. And its soldiers were always well fed. The organization of the kitchen in the camp was strictly regulated. Each legionary unit was allocated a specific place where a fire was lit. The fires did not just burn, but were located in special depressions so that the fire would not spread and the smoke would not interfere. Tripods with suspended cauldrons were placed above them. There was one cauldron for each unit of 8 to 10 people. The person in charge of the kitchen monitored the food supplies and quality. He also made sure that no one used dirty water. In large camps, where the legion stayed for several days, even more substantial kitchens were built. They could include stationary ovens for baking bread, which was much more convenient than baking flatbread on stones. There were always barrels of water near the kitchens so that soldiers could wash their hands and tools. In addition to the basic ingredients, the legionnaires' food could include other products. For example, if there was a sea or river nearby, fish could be added to the diet. In forest areas, soldiers could gather berries, mushrooms, and herbs. All this made their diet more varied, but in general, porridge was always the staple food. This food system was not just well thought out, it was part of military strategy. It allowed the army to be mobile and not dependent on local supplies. It also helped maintain the health and morale of the legionnaires, which was key to victory. History shows that the Roman Empire won not only because of the strength of its legions, but also because of its superior logistics. While other armies suffered from hunger and lack of supplies, Roman legionnaires were provided with everything they needed. This system allowed Rome to wage long wars, conquer vast territories, and rule over them. Roman roads, ships, warehouses, aqueducts, all of this was part of a single, ingeniously designed system that allowed the Roman Empire to exist for centuries. Roman logistics was a true art form. It was based on 3 pillars: planning, infrastructure, and discipline. Before starting any campaign, commanders carefully calculated all the needs of the army: how much grain, wine, oil, weapons, and tools would be needed. They took into account the size of the legions, the distance they had to travel, and the terrain. Based on this data, routes and supply points were created. The infrastructure created by the Romans was unprecedented. Roman roads allowed troops and supplies to be moved quickly and efficiently throughout the empire. These roads were so durable that some of them are still in use today. They were a symbol of Roman power and order, as well as a tool for controlling vast territories. Sea routes were another important element of logistics. The Romans built a huge fleet that transported grain and other goods from the provinces to Rome. This fleet was vital for supplying the capital and the legions stationed in remote corners of the empire. Merchant ships were large and spacious, and routes were carefully planned to avoid storms and pirate ambushes. The Romans even waged wars to protect their trade routes from pirates. Warehouses and granaries were another important element of the system. Every city and every legionary camp had warehouses where provisions were stored. These warehouses were designed to protect food from moisture and pests. Grain, wine, oil, and other goods were stored in them for years, allowing Rome to survive in the event of crop failure or temporary supply disruptions. Discipline was the last but not least important element. Roman legionaries were trained to take care of their equipment and food. They carried everything they needed to survive on the march: rations, camp tools, weapons. They knew how to cook, build camps, and survive in any conditions. This discipline was what set the Roman army apart from others. Roman logistics were not only military but also civil. They provided food to cities and provinces, which helped maintain order and stability in the empire. This system was complex and expensive, but it worked. It was what made Rome great. Ultimately, Rome won not only because of its military strength, but also because of its ability to govern a vast state. Logistics was what made this possible. It was the heart of the empire, nourishing it and allowing it to grow. And it was what made the Roman army invincible. We have covered only a small part of what Roman legionaries faced. What do you think was the most amazing thing about the Roman logistics system? Perhaps you were struck by the sophistication of the road network, or conversely, you did not expect fleet management to be part of military strategy? Tell us about it in the comments. We have looked at how the Romans fed their army and capital, but there are many other equally fascinating questions beyond this topic. For example, how did Roman medicine function during campaigns? What technologies were used to build siege engines? Or how were the triumphal processions, which were the culmination of military victories, organized? Suggest your topics, and together we will embark on a new historical journey. See you soon.